George Strait and his wife suffer humiliation at the airport, but their reaction moved America. What happens when a living legend gets mistaken for just another ordinary traveler? The answer would shock an entire airport and teach a lesson that millions would never forget. This is the story of how one young security guard's arrogance met the quiet dignity of country music royalty, creating a moment that would change lives forever. The fluorescent lights of Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport buzzed overhead as thousands of travelers hurried through the bustling corridors on that crisp Tuesday morning in October. Among them, walking hand in hand with the unhurried pace of people who had learned that life's greatest moments happen when you slow down enough to notice them, were George and Norma Strait. To anyone watching, they looked like any other couple in their 70s. Him in his weathered Stetson hat, faded Wrangler jeans with honest wear marks, and a simple plaid shirt that had seen better days. She wore a modest floral dress, comfortable walking shoes, and carried a small purse that had clearly been a faithful companion for many years. What the casual observer couldn't see was the extraordinary story these two ordinary-looking people carried with them. George Strait, the man adjusting his hat brim as they approached the security checkpoint, had sold over 100 million records worldwide. He held the record for most #1 hits in country music history, 60 songs that had topped the charts. He had filled stadiums, won every award the music industry could bestow, and earned the reverence of an entire generation of country music fans who called him simply the King. Yet here he was, carrying his own small duffel bag, no entourage in sight, no handlers clearing the way, just a man traveling with his wife of over 50 years. Norma squeezed his hand gently as they joined the line for first-class passengers. At 71, she still had the same warm smile that had captured George's heart when they were teenagers in Pearsall, Texas. She had been by his side through every triumph and heartbreak, from the early days when he played honky-tonk bars for $50 a night to the record-breaking farewell tour that grossed over $108 million. Through it all, she had insisted they stay grounded, that fame was just George's job, not their identity. "Remember when we used to drive everywhere?" Norma whispered, her eyes twinkling with the memory of cross-country trips in their old pickup truck during the early years of his career. George chuckled softly, the sound carrying the warmth of a man who had learned to find joy in simple moments. "Those were good days, weren't they? Just you, me, and the highway." His voice carried that distinctive Texas drawl that had made songs like Amarillo Morning and All My Exes Live in Texas into anthems of American life. If you're enjoying this story so far, we'd love to have you as part of our community. Please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We read every single one and love connecting with viewers from around the world. Your thoughts and experiences make these stories even more meaningful. They were headed to San Antonio, where George was scheduled to perform at a benefit concert for military veterans. It was the kind of cause that meant everything to him, honoring the men and women who had served their country with the same quiet dignity he tried to bring to his own life. The concert would raise over $2 million for veterans programs, but George had insisted that detail not be publicized. "It's not about the money," he had told the organizers. "It's about showing respect." As they approached the VIP lounge entrance, George felt Norma's hand tighten slightly in his. She had developed an instinct over the decades for sensing when situations might become complicated. Fame had taught them both to read rooms, to recognize when their presence might create a stir they'd rather avoid. George had always preferred to fly under the radar, to move through the world without fanfare. It was one of the reasons he had maintained such longevity in an industry that often consumed its stars. "Excuse me." The voice was sharp, authoritative, and carried the unmistakable tone of someone exercising newly granted power. "This area is for first-class passengers and platinum members only." George looked up to see a young man in his late 20s, his airport security uniform crisp and new, his badge gleaming as if it had been polished that morning. Kevin Reynolds had started working at DFW just 6 weeks earlier, and he was determined to prove himself worthy of the promotion he desperately wanted. He had studied the manual religiously, memorized every protocol, and made it his personal mission to enforce every rule to the letter. Kevin's eyes swept dismissively over the couple before him. He saw an elderly man in clothes that looked like they came from a farm supply store, and a woman whose entire outfit probably cost less than his monthly car payment. These were not the kind of people who belonged in the first-class lounge. These were the kind of people who probably flew southwest and brought their own sandwiches. "Of course," George replied gently, reaching into his shirt pocket for their boarding passes. "We have first-class tickets to San Antonio." Kevin's eyebrows rose skeptically. In his 6 weeks on the job, he had seen plenty of people try to bluff their way into areas where they didn't belong. But this was almost insulting in its obviousness. The man's boots were scuffed, his jeans had actual dirt on them, and his hat looked like something from a costume shop. The woman beside him carried a purse that was clearly second-hand. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification along with those tickets," Kevin said, his voice growing louder. "And I have to warn you that attempting to use fraudulent documents is a federal offense." The words hit George like a physical blow, not because of their accusation, but because of the way they made Norma flinch. In 53 years of marriage, he had watched her handle everything from screaming fans to intrusive paparazzi with grace and dignity. But there was something about being publicly questioned, about having their integrity challenged in front of strangers, that cut deeper than any tabloid headline ever could. George handed over their boarding passes and his driver's license, his movements calm and deliberate. He had learned long ago that reacting with anger only made difficult situations worse. "Here you go, son. Take all the time you need." Kevin snatched the documents, studying them with exaggerated care. The boarding passes were legitimate, first-class seats printed that morning. But the driver's license showed an address in Texas, and Kevin had seen enough movies to know that rich people lived in places like Beverly Hills or Manhattan, not some small town he'd never heard of. And the name on the license was George Harvey Strait Jr., not exactly the kind of name you'd expect from someone who could afford to fly first class. "These look suspicious to me," Kevin announced, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I mean, seriously, you expect me to believe that someone dressed like, well, like you, is flying first class? And what kind of name is George Harvey Strait Jr.? Sounds made up to me." Around them, other travelers began to slow their pace, drawn by the commotion. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that something interesting was developing. A few older passengers studied George's face with growing recognition, but the security guard's aggressive tone kept them from intervening. Norma's cheeks flushed red, not with embarrassment for herself, but with a protective anger she rarely allowed herself to feel. She had watched her husband handle critics and doubters throughout his career, had seen him maintain his composure in the face of everything from hostile interviews to industry politics. But this felt different. This wasn't about music or business. This was about their basic dignity as human beings. "Kevin," George's voice remained steady, but there was something in his tone that made the security guard pause. "That's your name, isn't it? I can see it on your badge. Kevin Reynolds. That's a good, strong name. I imagine your parents were proud when you got this job." The unexpected personal comment threw Kevin off balance. He had expected anger, demands to speak to supervisors, threats about knowing important people. He hadn't expected this calm, almost fatherly tone from a man he was convinced was trying to con his way into the VIP lounge. "Don't try to distract me with small talk," Kevin snapped, though his voice carried slightly less conviction than before. "I'm calling my supervisor and airport police. We'll see how real these tickets are when they run them through the system." But as Kevin reached for his radio, something was happening in the crowd around them. Phones were not just coming out, they were being raised, recording, and the murmurs weren't confused or curious anymore. They were excited, amazed, and increasingly angry on behalf of the quiet couple being humiliated by an overzealous security guard. "Oh my God," whispered a woman in her 60s, her voice carrying clearly in the suddenly hushed space around the security checkpoint. "That's George Strait. That's actually George Strait, and this kid has no idea who he's messing with." The whisper spread through the crowd like wildfire, each recognition sparking another until the air itself seemed to vibrate with excitement and disbelief. Kevin Reynolds, still clutching George's driver's license with white knuckles, remained blissfully unaware that he had just accused one of America's most beloved entertainers of fraud. His focus was entirely on what he perceived as his duty, protecting the airline from people who clearly didn't belong in first class. "Ma'am, please step back," Kevin barked at the woman who had spoken, his voice cracking slightly under the pressure of the growing crowd. "This is a security matter, and I need everyone to maintain distance while I handle these individuals." But the crowd wasn't stepping back. If anything, more people were gathering, drawn by the unmistakable buzz that occurs when something extraordinary is happening in an ordinary place. A businessman in his 50s pushed closer, his phone already recording. A group of college students on spring break stopped mid-conversation, their faces lighting up with recognition. An elderly couple from what looked like a ranch in Montana stood frozen, the woman's hand covering her mouth in shock. George felt the familiar weight of public attention settling around him like an old coat. Uncomfortable, but not unfamiliar. In 5 decades of performing, he had learned to read crowds, to sense when a situation was about to spiral beyond anyone's control. He could see it happening now, the way phones were multiplying, the way voices were rising with indignation on his behalf. This was exactly the kind of scene he had spent his entire career trying to avoid. "Norma," he said softly. His voice meant only for his wife's ears. "Just stay close to me, this will pass." But Norma wasn't looking at him. She was watching Kevin Reynolds, this young man who reminded her of their own son, Bubba, at that age, full of determination and righteousness, convinced that the world was black and white, that rules were rules and exceptions were just weakness in disguise. She saw something in Kevin's eyes that the crowd couldn't see, something that made her heart ache, despite the humiliation he was putting them through. He was scared, terrified actually, though he was doing everything in his power to hide it behind bluster and procedure. "Sir," Kevin continued, his voice growing louder as he tried to maintain control over a situation that was rapidly slipping away from him. "I'm going to need you and your wife to step aside while I verify these documents. And I'm asking everyone else to please disperse. This is not a public spectacle." But it had already become exactly that. Margaret Wilson, a flight attendant with 37 years of experience at American Airlines, was pushing through the crowd with the kind of purposeful movement that comes from decades of handling difficult situations. At 62, she had seen everything the airline industry could throw at her. Terrorist scares, medical emergencies, celebrity meltdowns, and entitled passengers of every variety. But she had never seen anything quite like this. Margaret had been working the Dallas-San Antonio route for 15 years, and in that time, she had served George and Norma Strait dozens of times. They were among her favorite passengers, always polite, always patient, and always appreciative of good service. George would often ask about her grandchildren, and Norma never failed to compliment the crew on their professionalism. They tipped well, but not ostentatiously. They never demanded special treatment, and they had the rare quality of making everyone around them feel valued. More importantly, Margaret had been raised on George Strait's music. Her late husband had proposed to her at a George Strait concert in 1985, during Amarillo Morning. Their first dance at their wedding had been to "I Cross My Heart." When her husband died of cancer 3 years earlier, she had played "Carrying Your Love with Me" at his funeral, because it perfectly captured how his love continued to sustain her even after he was gone. Watching this young security guard humiliate her musical hero and his gracious wife was more than Margaret could bear. "Kevin Reynolds," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been dealing with airline protocols since before Kevin was born. "Step away from those passengers immediately." Kevin whirled around, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and panic. He recognized Margaret as one of the senior flight attendants, someone whose opinion carried weight with management. But he was committed now, had gone too far to back down without losing face completely. "Ms. Wilson, these individuals are attempting to board with what appear to be fraudulent documents. I'm following standard security protocols for suspicious—" "Those individuals," Margaret interrupted, her voice cutting through his explanation like a knife through butter, "are Mr. and Mrs. George Strait. Mr. Strait is quite possibly the most successful country music artist in American history, with over 100 million albums sold worldwide and 60 number-one hits on the country charts. He has been flying with our airline for over 20 years, and he and Mrs. Strait are platinum-level frequent flyers." The silence that followed was deafening. Kevin's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. Around them, the crowd had grown to nearly 50 people, all staring at the young security guard who had just made what was quite possibly the most embarrassing mistake in Dallas-Fort Worth airport history. That's not possible," Kevin whispered, though even as he said it, he could feel the certainty draining out of him like water from a broken dam. "I mean, look at them. They're dressed like normal people." Margaret's voice was gentle now, but her words carried the weight of absolute truth. Like a man and woman who have been married for 53 years and don't feel the need to prove their worth through expensive clothing. Like people who understand that real class has nothing to do with designer labels. Kevin's eyes darted frantically between Margaret's face and the boarding passes in his trembling hands. For the first time, he actually read them carefully. First-class seats, premium service, frequent flyer numbers that indicated the highest level of membership. And the name on the license he had been so quick to dismiss suddenly seemed less ridiculous and more familiar. George Strait, he mumbled, the words tasting strange in his mouth. George Harvey Strait. The king of country music, said the businessman who had been recording everything, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and second-hand embarrassment for the security guard. 60 #1 hits. More than Elvis, more than the Beatles, more than anyone in the history of popular music. Straight country? Does Fort Worth ever cross your mind? Oceanfront property? Added the woman from Montana, her voice picking up steam as she listed album titles that had provided the soundtrack to her life. Pure country, blue clear sky, carrying your love with me. I saw him in concert 47 times, called out another voice from the crowd. Best live performer I ever witnessed. Pure class every single time. Kevin felt the weight of 50 pairs of eyes on him, all witnessing his monumental mistake. His supervisor would hear about this within minutes. His probationary employment status suddenly seemed very precarious indeed. But worse than the professional consequences was the growing realization of what he had done to two people who had been nothing but kind to him. George Strait, the man Kevin had accused of fraud, stepped forward slightly. His movements were calm, deliberate, and carried a dignity that somehow made Kevin feel even smaller than he already did. "Son," George said, his voice carrying that same gentle tone he had used throughout the confrontation. "Mistakes happen. The important thing is what we learn from them." But Kevin wasn't ready for kindness. Kindness was worse than anger, worse than threats or demands for his job. Kindness meant he had to confront not just his error, but the ugly assumptions that had led to it. I don't understand," Kevin stammered, his voice barely audible. You're actually—" "George Strait," Margaret confirmed, stepping closer to the young man who looked like he might collapse at any moment. "And you just spent the last 10 minutes publicly humiliating him and his wife, questioning their integrity, and threatening them with federal charges." The crowd murmured agreement, some with anger, others with something approaching pity for the security guard who had dug himself into such a deep hole. Phones continued to record every moment, ensuring that this encounter would be preserved forever in digital amber. Norma Strait, who had remained largely silent throughout the ordeal, finally spoke. Her voice was soft but clear, carrying the wisdom of a woman who had spent decades watching her husband handle difficult people with grace. "He's just doing his job, George," she said, her words intended for her husband but loud enough for everyone to hear. "He's young. He's learning. We all made mistakes when we were learning." Her kindness was almost too much for Kevin to bear. The weight of his mistake crashed down on Kevin Reynolds like a collapsing building. Every protocol he had memorized, every procedure he had studied so diligently, every rule he had been so determined to enforce, none of it had prepared him for this moment. He stood frozen in the middle of one of the busiest airports in America, holding the identification of a living legend he had just accused of fraud, surrounded by dozens of witnesses who had recorded every second of his humiliation of two of the most gracious people he would ever meet. His hands shook as he looked down at the driver's license again, as if the name might have changed in the last few seconds. But there it was, clear as day, George Harvey Strait Jr. The address listed was indeed in Texas, but not because George couldn't afford to live somewhere more prestigious. It was because he had chosen to stay rooted in the place that had made him who he was, the place where he and Norma had built their life together long before fame ever entered the picture. "Mr. Strait," Kevin whispered, the title feeling foreign on his tongue after the casual disrespect he had shown just minutes earlier. I don't know what to say." The crowd around them had continued to grow, but something strange was happening. Instead of the angry mob Kevin might have expected, there was an almost reverent quiet settling over the space. People were still recording, still watching with intense interest, but there was a sense that they were witnessing something significant, something that transcended a simple case of mistaken identity. Margaret Wilson stepped closer to Kevin, her expression softening as she saw the genuine anguish in his young face. She had children of her own, grandchildren not much younger than this security guard, and she recognized the look of someone who had just learned a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. "Kevin," she said gently, "do you know why Mr. and Mrs. Strait are traveling to San Antonio today?" Kevin shook his head, not trusting his voice to work properly. "He's performing at a benefit concert for military veterans," Margaret continued. "Performing for free, raising money for people who served our country. The same kind of service and dedication you thought you were showing when you stopped them at this checkpoint." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the crowd. Here was a man who had dedicated his life to entertaining and giving back to others, being questioned by someone whose job was supposed to be protecting and serving travelers. But instead of the explosive confrontation everyone expected, something entirely different was unfolding. George Strait stepped forward, and the crowd instinctively gave him space. At 71, he moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had performed in front of millions, but never lost sight of where he came from. His Stetson hat cast a slight shadow over his eyes, but his expression was clear. Not angry, not vindictive, but thoughtful in the way of someone who understood that this moment was about much more than one young man's mistake. "Kevin," George said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by everyone nearby, "how long have you been working here?" "6 weeks, sir," Kevin replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "And before this job?" Kevin swallowed hard. I was unemployed for 8 months, sir. My girlfriend Sarah, she's pregnant with our first child due in December. I was desperate for work, any work. When I got this job, I promised myself I'd do everything perfectly. I couldn't afford to mess up." The vulnerability in his admission seemed to ripple through the crowd. These weren't just abstract figures in an airport drama anymore. This was a young man trying to provide for his growing family, trying to prove himself worthy of a job he desperately needed. "What's your daughter going to be named?" Norma asked, speaking for the second time since the confrontation began. "Emma," Kevin replied automatically, then caught himself. "Wait, how did you know it was a daughter?" Norma smiled, the same warm expression she had shared with thousands of fans over the decades, the smile that had made George fall in love with her when they were both teenagers. "A mother knows these things, and Emma is a beautiful name." George watched the exchange between his wife and the security guard, seeing something that the crowd couldn't see. He had been in the entertainment industry long enough to recognize genuine remorse from calculated damage control. Kevin Reynolds wasn't trying to save his job or avoid consequences. He was genuinely horrified by what he had done, and more importantly, he was beginning to understand why it was wrong. "Son," George continued, "do you know what I was doing when I was your age?" Kevin shook his head. "I was working on a cattle ranch in Big Wells, Texas. Married Norma when we were both 19. Barely had 2 nickels to rub together. I played music on weekends for $50 a night when I was lucky enough to get booked. Wore the same pair of boots for 3 years because we couldn't afford new ones." The crowd listened in fascination as one of country music's biggest stars shared details of his humble beginnings with a security guard who had just humiliated him publicly. "But you know what I learned during those lean years?" George asked. "I learned that a person's worth has nothing to do with the clothes on their back or the car they drive. It has everything to do with how they treat other people, especially when they think nobody important is watching." Kevin felt tears threatening to spill over. This wasn't the lecture he had expected, wasn't the public shaming he probably deserved. This was something far more powerful, a lesson wrapped in kindness from someone who had every right to be furious. "Mr. Strait," Kevin began, his voice cracking with emotion, "I am so sorry. I judged you and Mrs. Strait based on your clothes, based on assumptions I had no right to make. I was wrong, completely wrong, and I understand if you want me fired." "Fired?" George looked genuinely surprised. "Son, why would I want you fired for doing what you thought was your job?" "Because I was disrespectful. Because I embarrassed you and Mrs. Strait in front of all these people. Because I accused you of fraud, when you've never done anything but contribute positively to this world." George removed his hat, running his fingers through his silver hair, in a gesture that somehow made him look both more human and more dignified. "Kevin, do you think this is the first time someone has misjudged me? Do you think this is the worst thing anyone has ever said about me?" He gestured to the crowd around them, many of whom were still recording every word. "I've been in the public eye for over 40 years. I've been called everything you can imagine. had my music criticized, my personal life dissected, my choices questioned by people who've never met me. But you know what I've learned? The people who matter, the people whose opinions count, they judge you by your actions over time, not by one moment, one mistake, one bad day. A businessman near the back of the crowd called out, "Tell him about the time you helped that family in Austin. Or when you paid for that veteran's medical bills," added another voice. "What about all the scholarships you've funded?" came a third shout. George held up his hand, a gentle gesture that immediately quieted the crowd. "Those aren't things I did for recognition. They're things I did because it was the right thing to do, just like you were trying to do the right thing today, Kevin. You saw what looked like people trying to take advantage of the system, and you tried to protect it. Your heart was in the right place. But I was so wrong about you," Kevin protested. "You were wrong about our clothes and our car and where we live," George agreed. "But you weren't wrong about trying to do your job with integrity. You weren't wrong about taking your responsibilities seriously. And you certainly weren't wrong about wanting to provide for Emma and Sarah." The mention of his family seemed to steady Kevin slightly. He straightened his shoulders and looked directly at George for the first time since learning his identity. "What can I do to make this right?" he asked. George smiled, the same easy grin that had charmed audiences for decades. "You can remember this moment. Remember how it felt to realize you had made assumptions about someone based on their appearance. And the next time you see an elderly couple dressed simply, or a young person in clothes that have seen better days, or anyone who doesn't look like your idea of what a first-class passenger should look like, you can remember that everyone has a story you don't know." "I will," Kevin promised, and everyone watching could tell he meant it. "And Kevin," Norma added softly. "Yes, ma'am. When little Emma is old enough to understand, you tell her about today. You tell her that her daddy learned something important about not judging people by their appearances. That lesson will serve her well in life." Margaret Wilson, who had been watching this entire exchange with growing amazement, stepped forward. "Mr. and Mrs. Strait, your flight is boarding in 10 minutes. I'd be honored to escort you to the gate personally." But George wasn't finished yet. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, the kind that clearly held sentimental value rather than status. From it, he extracted a business card and handed it to Kevin. "This is my manager's contact information," he said. "When Emma is born, you call that number and let them know. We'd like to send a little gift to welcome her to the world." Kevin took the card with trembling hands, staring at it as if it might disappear. Around them, the crowd began to applaud, not the polite appreciation typically reserved for celebrities, but the genuine admiration for witnessing something beautiful and rare in an ordinary place. But George Strait wasn't done surprising everyone yet. As the applause began to die down, George reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something that made Margaret Wilson's eyes widen in recognition. It was a small leather-bound notebook, the kind musicians use to jot down song lyrics and tour dates, but this particular notebook had been George's constant companion for over 30 years, filled with more than just music. It contained phone numbers of people he had met along the way, addresses of families he had helped, notes about conversations that had touched his heart. "Kevin," George said, flipping through several pages until he found what he was looking for, "I want to tell you something that might surprise you. This isn't the first time someone has questioned whether I belonged somewhere based on how I was dressed." The crowd leaned in closer, sensing that they were about to hear something significant. It was 1981, and I had just signed my first record deal with MCA Records. Norma and I drove up to Nashville in our old pickup truck, the same one we'd had since we got married. I was wearing jeans and boots, just like today, because that's who I was then, and that's who I am now. George's voice took on the rhythm of a practiced storyteller, the same cadence that had made him one of country music's most compelling performers. "We went to this fancy restaurant to celebrate the record deal. The hostess took one look at us and said we'd have to wait outside because there was a dress code. Said people like us belonged at the diner down the street, not in a place where real recording artists ate." Norma nodded, her eyes soft with the memory. "I wanted to leave, I was so embarrassed." "But I wasn't embarrassed," George continued. "I was curious. I asked that hostess what she thought a real recording artist looked like. She pointed to a table where a man in an expensive suit was holding court with several people in business attire. 'Like him,' she said. 'Someone with class and sophistication.'" Kevin found himself completely absorbed in the story, his earlier humiliation temporarily forgotten in his fascination with where this was leading. "So I walked over to that table," George said, his eyes twinkling with the memory, and I introduced myself to the man in the expensive suit. Turned out he was a record executive from New York, someone I was supposed to meet with the next week. And do you know what he said when I told him who I was? The crowd was hanging on every word. He said, "Thank God." I was beginning to think Nashville had forgotten what real country music looks like. Then he stood up, shook my hand, and told everyone in that restaurant that he was honored to meet the future of country music. The same hostess who had tried to turn us away ended up asking for my autograph. Margaret smiled, understanding exactly where George was going with this story. The point is, Kevin, that hostess made the same mistake you made today. She judged a book by its cover. But here's the difference. She never got the chance to learn from her mistake the way you have. When people complained about the service that night, she got defensive. She blamed us for not meeting her expectations, instead of questioning why her expectations were wrong in the first place. George closed the notebook and returned it to his pocket, but not before Kevin caught a glimpse of dozens of pages filled with handwritten notes. You, on the other hand, have shown something that hostess never did. You listened. You acknowledged your mistake. You asked what you could do to make it right. That tells me more about your character than any mistake ever could. A woman in the crowd called out, "What happened to the hostess?" George shrugged. "Last I heard, she was still working at that same restaurant, still judging people by their clothes instead of their character. Some people never learn, but Kevin here, he's going to be different." Kevin felt something shift inside him, a fundamental change in how he saw not just his job, but his role in other people's lives. "Mr. Strait, how do you do it? How do you stay so kind when people treat you badly?" "Because, son, kindness is a choice, and it's the only choice that ever really changes anything." George gestured to the crowd around them. "Look at all these people. They came here expecting to see me angry, expecting drama, maybe hoping to see someone famous lose their temper. Instead, they got to witness something better. They got to see that it's possible to respond to mistakes with grace instead of anger." A teenage girl near the front of the crowd suddenly spoke up, her voice shaking with emotion. "Mr. Strait, my grandmother used to play your music every Sunday when she made dinner. She died last month, and hearing you talk like this, it's exactly what she would have said. She always told me that how you treat people when you're upset shows who you really are." George's expression softened even more. "What was your grandmother's name, sweetheart?" "Rose Martinez. She lived in San Antonio. She probably went to a dozen of your concerts over the years." "Rose Martinez," George repeated thoughtfully. "The name sounds familiar. Did she ever send letters to fan mail addresses?" The girl's eyes widened. "Yes. She wrote to you every year on her birthday, telling you how your music helped her through difficult times." George nodded slowly. "I remember those letters. Beautiful handwriting, always signed your faithful listener, Rose. I kept several of them in my office." She had a way of finding hope in difficult circumstances. The girl began to cry, overwhelmed by the realization that her grandmother's letters had actually reached her musical hero. "Tell you what," George said, pulling out his phone. "Give me your address, and I'll make sure you get copies of your grandmother's letters. They belong with family." As the girl fumbled for a pen to write down her information, Kevin watched in amazement. Here was a man who had just been publicly humiliated, who had every right to be furious, who could have demanded apologies and consequences. Instead, he was comforting a grieving teenager and promising to share precious mementos with someone he had never met. "Mr. Strait," Kevin said, his voice stronger now, filled with a new resolve. "I want you to know that I'm going to be different from now on. Not just at work, but in everything I do. When Emma is born, when I'm raising her, when I'm interacting with people every day, I'm going to remember this moment. That's all any of us can do," George replied. "Learn from our mistakes and try to be better tomorrow than we were today." Margaret Wilson checked her watch and cleared her throat gently. "Mr. and Mrs. Strait, I really do need to get you to the gate now. We're cutting it close for departure." George nodded and turned to address the crowd one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for witnessing this today. But I want you to remember something important. Kevin Reynolds is a good man who made an honest mistake. He's going to be a wonderful father and a valuable employee. I don't want to see this moment turned into something that hurts him or his family. Social media can be a powerful tool for good, but it can also be destructive. I'm asking you to use your influence to build up rather than tear down." The crowd murmured agreement, and several people were already typing on their phones, not to shame Kevin, but to share George's message of forgiveness and understanding. As George and Norma began walking toward their gate, Kevin called out one more time, "Mr. Strait, wait!" George turned back, his eyebrows raised in curiosity. "The concert tonight," Kevin said, his voice carrying across the now quiet space. "How much are tickets?" George smiled. "It's sold out, son. Has been for months." Kevin's face fell slightly. I wanted to hear you perform. After everything that's happened today, I feel like I need to understand who you really are as an artist, not just the kind man who forgave my stupidity." George exchanged a look with Norma, one of those wordless conversations that couples develop after decades of marriage. She nodded, almost imperceptibly. "Margaret," George called to the flight attendant, "do we have time for one more stop before boarding?" Margaret checked her watch again and grimaced. "We really shouldn't. But for you, Mr. Strait, I think I can buy us a few more minutes." George walked back to Kevin and reached into his jacket pocket once more. This time he pulled out an envelope that looked like it had been prepared well in advance of this encounter. "Kevin," he said, pressing the envelope into the young man's hands, "this contains 2 VIP tickets to tonight's concert, backstage passes for you and Sarah, and a little something extra for baby Emma." Kevin's hands trembled as he accepted the envelope. But why? After what I did to you?" "Because," George said, adjusting his hat one final time before heading to his flight, "sometimes the people who challenge us the most are the ones who teach us the most about ourselves. You reminded me today why I do what I do, why kindness matters, and why every interaction with another human being is an opportunity to make the world a little better." As George and Norma finally made their way toward the gate, escorted by Margaret and followed by the lingering crowd, Kevin stood alone in the middle of the security checkpoint, holding an envelope that represented far more than concert tickets. It represented second chances, undeserved grace, and the power of choosing kindness over anger. But the biggest surprise of all was still waiting inside that envelope. 3 hours later, Kevin Reynolds sat in his small apartment in Arlington, Texas, staring at the envelope George Strait had given him. Sarah, his pregnant girlfriend, was curled up beside him on their second-hand couch, her hand resting on her growing belly where little Emma was beginning to show signs of becoming an active baby. The afternoon sun filtered through their modest living room window, casting a warm glow over the scene that felt almost surreal after the morning's events. "Are you going to open it?" Sarah asked gently. She had listened in amazement as Kevin recounted every detail of his encounter with the country music legend, his voice filled with a mixture of lingering embarrassment and profound gratitude. Kevin turned the envelope over in his hands. His name was written on the front in George's own handwriting, neat, careful letters that somehow conveyed the same thoughtfulness the man had shown throughout their entire interaction. Inside, Kevin could feel what were obviously the concert tickets George had promised, but there was something else, something thicker that crinkled slightly when he pressed the envelope. "I still can't believe it happened," Kevin murmured. I humiliated George Strait, Sarah. The George Strait. And instead of getting me fired or publicly shaming me, he gave me life advice and concert tickets." Sarah smiled, the same gentle expression that had made Kevin fall in love with her 3 years earlier. "You know what I think? I think maybe this wasn't just a coincidence. Maybe Emma needed her daddy to learn this lesson before she arrived." Kevin carefully opened the envelope, and immediately 2 VIP tickets fell into his lap. But it was the handwritten letter that followed that made his breath catch in his throat. "Dear Kevin and Sarah," he read aloud, his voice growing stronger with each word. "By the time you read this, you'll probably think the concert tickets are the real gift in this envelope, but I want you to know that the real gift you gave me today was the reminder that every person we meet is fighting battles we know nothing about, carrying dreams we can't see, and deserving of the same respect we hope to receive ourselves." Sarah leaned closer, her eyes already misting as Kevin continued reading. "Kevin, you mentioned that you were unemployed for 8 months before getting your job at the airport. I know that kind of stress, that kind of fear about providing for the people you love. When Norma and I were your age, I worked cattle during the day and played music at night, sometimes driving 300 miles for a $50 gig, just hoping to make enough money to keep our lights on." Kevin paused, overwhelmed by the realization that his hero had once faced the same struggles he was facing now. "What I learned during those difficult years is that our circumstances don't define our character. Our choices do. Today you made a mistake, but then you made a choice. You chose to listen, to learn, and to genuinely apologize. That choice tells me everything I need to know about the kind of man you are and the kind of father you're going to be to Emma. Sarah squeezed Kevin's hand as he continued reading. Enclosed with this letter, you'll find something I want you to use for Emma's future. It's not charity and it's not pity. It's an investment in a little girl whose father showed me that integrity and humility are still alive in the world. Kevin's hands shook as he reached back into the envelope and pulled out a cashier's check. When he saw the amount, he nearly dropped it. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible, It's $50,000. Sarah stared at the check, then at her boyfriend, then back at the check. That's enough for Emma's entire college education. That's enough to change our lives." But Kevin was still reading the letter. "This money comes with only one condition. I want you to promise me that you'll tell Emma this story when she's old enough to understand it. Tell her that her college fund came from a day when her father made a mistake, but chose to learn from it instead of making excuses. Tell her that kindness and respect are more valuable than money, but that sometimes the universe provides both when you choose to do the right thing." Kevin had to stop reading for a moment, overwhelmed by the magnitude of George's generosity. "There's more," Sarah said softly, pointing to the bottom of the letter. "Kevin, I've been in the music business for over 40 years, and I've learned to recognize authenticity when I see it. Your supervisor at the airport, Ms. Patricia Gonzalez, called me this afternoon. Apparently, several passengers who witnessed our encounter contacted the airline to praise your professionalism and willingness to learn from your mistake. You're being promoted to head of passenger relations, effective immediately with a significant salary increase." Kevin looked at Sarah in disbelief. He called my supervisor?" Sarah was crying now, happy tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized their financial struggles were over, their future secured by the kindness of a man they had never met until that morning. "One final thing," Kevin continued reading. "Tonight at the concert, I'm going to tell this story, not to embarrass you, but to honor you. Because in a world where people are quick to judge and slow to forgive, you reminded me that there are still good people out there who are willing to admit their mistakes and grow from them." The letter was signed simply, "With respect and best wishes for your growing family, George Strait." But there was a postscript in different handwriting, clearly Norma's. "P.S. Sarah, enclosed you'll also find my grandmother's recipe for peach cobbler. It was the first thing I ever cooked for George, and it's been our tradition to make it every Sunday for 53 years. I thought you might like to start your own family tradition. Congratulations on Emma's upcoming arrival. Norma Strait." That evening, Kevin and Sarah found themselves in VIP seats at the Majestic Theater in San Antonio, surrounded by thousands of George Strait fans who had no idea they were sitting next to the couple from the airport incident. As George took the stage in his signature style, simple, understated, letting his music speak for itself, Kevin felt a profound sense of gratitude that went far beyond the material gifts he had received. Halfway through the concert, George paused between songs and addressed the audience. "Folks, I want to tell you about something that happened to me today," he began, his voice carrying easily through the packed theater. "I met a young man who reminded me of something important about the kind of person I want to be." Kevin felt Sarah's hand tighten in his as George began telling their story, but not in the way Kevin had feared. George didn't mention names or specific details that would embarrass anyone. Instead, he talked about the importance of giving people the benefit of the doubt, about choosing kindness over anger, and about recognizing that everyone deserves respect, regardless of their appearance or circumstances. "You see," George continued, "this young man could have gotten defensive when he realized his mistake. He could have made excuses or tried to shift the blame. Instead, he did something rare and beautiful. He owned his error, asked how he could make it right, and showed me that integrity isn't about never making mistakes. It's about how you handle yourself when you do." The audience erupted in applause, not knowing they were applauding the young couple sitting in the VIP section. "So tonight, I want to dedicate this next song to all the young parents out there, all the people working hard to provide for their families, all the folks who are brave enough to admit when they're wrong and strong enough to learn from their mistakes." As George launched into "I Cross My Heart," the same song that had been his and Norma's wedding song, Kevin felt something shift in his understanding of what it meant to be a good man. It wasn't about never falling down. It was about how you got back up, how you treated others along the way, and whether you used your experiences to become better or bitter. 6 months later, Kevin Reynolds stood in the maternity ward of Texas Presbyterian Hospital, holding his newborn daughter Emma for the first time. In the weeks leading up to her birth, he had been promoted twice more at the airline, earning recognition for his exceptional people skills and his ability to turn potentially negative situations into positive customer experiences. The story of his encounter with George Strait had indeed gone viral, but not in the way Kevin had feared. Instead of becoming a cautionary tale about prejudging people, it had become an inspiration story about grace, forgiveness, and second chances. Kevin had received hundreds of messages from people around the world who had been touched by George's response to his mistake. As he looked down at Emma's perfect little face, Kevin whispered the promise he had made in his heart that day at the airport. "I'm going to tell you this story someday, little one. I'm going to tell you about the day your college fund came from a country music legend who taught your daddy that kindness is always the right choice. And I'm going to make sure you grow up knowing that how we treat people, especially people who are different from us or who make mistakes, is what defines who we really are." Outside Emma's hospital room window, the Texas sun was setting, painting the sky in the same warm colors that had filled the airport that morning, when a simple case of mistaken identity became a lesson in human dignity that would be remembered for generations. George Strait's music had always been about authentic American values: love, family, hard work, and treating people with respect. But on that ordinary Tuesday morning in a busy airport, he had proven that those weren't just lyrics in his songs. They were the principles he lived by, even when no one was watching, even when he had every right to respond with anger instead of grace. And in the end, that's what transformed a potentially humiliating encounter into a story of hope that reminded the world that class, dignity, and kindness never go out of style.